Welcome, everyone. So, quick disclaimer. This discussion is for educational purposes only. You should not rely on this information as a substitute for, nor should it replace professional medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. If you have any concerns or questions about your health, you should always consult with a doctor or other healthcare professional. So, this is the first in a series of conversations with specialist guests on the psychology of the ends. I'm using ends as a term for areas across the UK with a lot of ethnic minorities, immigrants, Black people, working class people, people who identify with street culture, and generally the less represented groups in the UK. Today we're talking about racial trauma, which I think is a great topic to get us started in the series. And yeah, I think, the purpose of these sessions will be to explore and debate both what we know and areas where there isn't as much certainty. So thanks everyone for joining us. We've got Vivienne and Stephen. So Vivienne is a clinical associate in psychology trainee, a singer-songwriter, and co-founder and community outreach and wellbeing director of ADHD Babes. ADHD Babes is a community and supportive space for Black women and non-binary people with ADHD to improve wellbeing and promote good mental health. Stephen is an award-winning artist practicing under the name Quiet Voice and a trainee psychotherapist. Stephen's most recent audiovisual art installation was Black Men's Minds, developed in response to stats showing Black men disproportionately sectioned under the Mental Health Act. He has also helped set up Lambeth and Southwark Minds Black River Counselling Service and is consultant on Hood Mentality, a project to engage young Black men in their mental well-being. I'm hosting and chairing us today. My name's Alex, and I'm a writer and mental health advocate, currently finishing up a book on the topic of the effects of racism on our minds. So we're all going to give some comments, and then we'll go into a bit of a discussion at the end. So I think just before we do that, I think it's useful to add a little bit of context to the discussion. So, we're talking today within COVID restrictions. So COVID-19 has been going on for the past few months, the better part of the year. And earlier this year, the tragic murder of George Floyd sparked protests here and in the US and across the world. And that sort of resulted in conversations about racial trauma. So these things give context to the conversation we're about to have today. So thanks for joining us. And Vivienne is going to give her introductory comments.
Cool. So should I just kick off?
Please.
Okay, so I'm going to try my best to keep this very brief. But the way I understand racial trauma, especially when you consider the scope of looking at it in ends, is looking at intersectionality. And if you haven't heard the term, it's kind of looking at the different aspects of who we are, whether it's our race, our religion, our education level, and how those different aspects can affect how we're treated in society. So as you can see, this kind of diagram looks at it on a spectrum where there's a dominant part of society where there's certain things that put you in favor, whether that's having white skin or being upper class or being highly educated or even being a certain religion. And then there's things on the bottom, such as being a female, maybe being of a darker race, such as from the Black race, being working class. And these are all things that affect how your living experience is, and that can also have an effect on your mental health. So moving on to the next page. Cool. So some of the contributing factors that can affect Black people from certain areas within the UK are things like discrimination, institutionalized racism, social inequality, structural violence, and cultural norms. And this kind of fits into the concept of intersectionality because these are all different aspects of our character and who we are as people growing up in these kind of areas. So when you look at things like discrimination, you have microaggressions. That can be as small as, you know, someone making a comment about your hair, or unconscious bias coming out when someone crosses the road when you're walking past them in a hoodie. It also goes on to how we're treated by society. So things like high stop and search levels that people from the Black community and Asian community experience can all have a negative effect on your mental health. Then you have institutionalized racism that's a lot more, I guess, prominent and in spaces that are supposed to protect. So things like the NHS that have stats such as Black men having the highest rate for psychosis, higher detention rates, and more likely to be sectioned rather than have a voluntary admission into mental health services. And then when you look at Black women's stats, you see that we are most likely to have a mental health disorder, but less likely to get treatment. There's also a theory by Keating that looks at the cycle of fear, that talks about the fact that there is a fear from mental health professionals towards the Black community where we're seen as intimidating or scary, and that in turn affects how they treat us and how we view them, and it creates a lack of trust between the Black community and mental health services. So following on from that, and then seeing that there's a lack of access into this health system that's culturally appropriate, you can imagine someone from ends who, you know, maybe they've heard stories about how people have been treated within the mental health system, they've known people that have been held on a section. Was that my timing?
No, so
you know, people that's been held in a section, it affects how. Sorry, say that again?
I said you got plenty of time.
Oh, cool. So yeah, so that goes on to affect how the Black community's relationship is with mental health services. And if you look at the end, you know, there's a certain way that we might speak, a way that we might dress, and that can be misinterpreted by mental health professionals. So lack of understanding of, or a lack of cultural awareness can also have an effect. Then you look at social inequalities. So, you know, people who might be working class or might grow up on a council estate, who might have reduced income or might have gone to a school that is not necessarily the most engaging, then has a knock-on effect on your career prospects and how disillusionized you are from the whole education system in general. If you look at stats, Black men have the highest exclusion rate in secondary school, which then goes on to affect your career prospects as well. So these are all things that are kind of adding on to the bigger picture. And then you look at structural violence, which is again even bigger. When you see things like the Windrush scandal, the kind of language around things like Brexit and anti-immigration, and then when you see, like Alex mentioned earlier, deaths of Black people on live screen that are accessible by the click of a button, these all have psychological effects on how you feel about yourself and how you feel society view you. And then finally, you've got the cultural differences. So I definitely growing up, where I grew up, there was a thing about weakness and not wanting to be seen as weak, because then you can be taken advantage of, or, you know, people can mug you off and that's not what you want. So kind of hiding the weakness and not seeing expression as a good thing. Then there's the fact that a lot of us may be second generation. So our parents may have come from a generation where they were immigrants, where they had to work extra hard, and they told us that we need to work twice as hard to, you know, get to where we need to be. And then that has a knock-on effect on how much you look and talk about the difficulties that you experience. So one of the sayings that we had growing up is, don't wash your dirty laundry outside. So that's not talking about the difficulties that are going on inside. And when that generation before us had to come and work so hard, they may not have had the time to discuss and look at how they were feeling internally, because they had, you know, bigger things that they needed to think about, such as getting a roof over our heads or putting food on the table. So if you look at Maslow's hierarchy of needs, the immediate need is to say, look, we need a house, we need money. So you don't really get time to look at the kind of psychological things that are going on. And those interracial conversations didn't necessarily happen for a lot of us. So then moving on to the last slide, to kind of pull it all together, there's a theory that was created by McGee and Stovall, where they describe the long-term effect of physical, mental, emotional, and psychological effects of racism and of living in a society characterized by white dominance and privilege. So if you kind of imagine a picture of, you know, someone growing up in a certain area, they may have been excluded from school, their employment prospects are harder, you know, they're viewed by society in a certain way, they see the way society treats them and people that look like them. If you look at it in a way where, you know, our capacity is a bucket, adding on all these things makes your bucket more likely to overfill. So all these kind of contributing factors is what makes it very difficult for mental health to be spoken about within our group. So moving on to the last slide. I think it's the last slide. Yeah. So the solution is as complex as the problem. Some of the things that might be beneficial is having actual culturally accessible services where these are spaces that people like me, people from ends, feel like they're able to speak or feel like they have a platform. And it's actually reaching out to them. Community support that's from and with the NHS. There already are community spaces that are doing these things. So the NHS to wrap around that and breaking the stigma of mental health within the Black community. There's still sometimes a sense of shame around having mental health conditions. So kind of having those conversations out loud and kind of addressing it in the same way that physical health is not stigmatized, mental health shouldn't be either. And then continuing these conversations like we're having now. So I think that's within time.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Vivienne. That's great. And now, Stephen, if you wouldn't mind, I'm just going to stop sharing. Okay. You're on mute, Stephen.
Right, first mistake, right? I hope that my, what I have to say kind of works alongside Vivienne's. I think it does actually. But I work in many different ways. As Alex said, I work as a psychotherapist and a counsellor, and I also create kind of therapeutic settings to kind of engage young Black men. And in my training and work within psychotherapy, I raise with many different people. So it could be men, women, different genders, or different races and so on. But a large part of my practice is working with Black men, and that was actually the reason why I started training as a psychotherapist. So when I was thinking about this thing about racial trauma, I was trying to sort of think, scale it back a little bit, or go back a little bit and just think about the concept of race and the construct of race. And that was in the early 16th century. The original term race kind of signified just a class of person. It was just a category or a class of person. And by the late 18th century, the word denoted a physical connotation. And then by the 19th century, ideas of race, which was promoted by Darwin, the kind of father of evolution and all that kind of stuff, were used to kind of justify genocide, slavery, imperialism. And in so doing, they kind of projected the kind of inhumanity of European nations into Africans, or into enslaved Africans. And the reason why this is problematic, or the reason why I bring this up, is because it's impossible to come to an encompassing truth about difference. And that's what West tries to do, or attempts to do. The truth about difference in meaning, in genetics, in culture is almost like a way of labeling people to what are seen as true standards. And this kind of supremacy, imperialism, or whatever, is really at the heart of what I see as racial trauma. So first of all, I want to say that, when I speak about people generally, one of the things which is in the forefront of my mind is that I'm speaking about Black men here. A lot of what I was saying will be relevant to Black women, of course, because we share a similar experience in some ways. But every single Black man is unique and multifaceted and has an individual story. But there are things that we share in common, experiences of being Black. So one of the themes when I'm working with Black men that I see is present are themes around kind of power and masculinity. And as Vivienne said, there's a sense of showing vulnerability is weakness. And it was quite interesting to kind of hear Vivienne's kind of take on that, which kind of adds to this actually. But what that does betray is a kind of reality of Black men's experience of trauma. And as Vivienne was saying, that's in the education system, seeing boys as thugs, overly expelled. There's images in the media of Black men as being like, sexual deviants, dictators, murderers. I mean, I'm fed up of looking at, Apple News and just sort of seeing pictures of Black men, which says that he's the worst serial killer of all time or something like that. And then there's the kind of trauma of stop and search and the kind of humiliations that young Black boys have to undergo when they're stopped They're kind of held up in the street, oftentimes for no reason. And then there's also this kind of idea of black on black crime, or this fact of black on black crime. But one of the things I kind of think about that is that, you know, when as a young black boy or a young black man, when you experience your friend being murdered or yourself being stabbed or something, that is not seen as them being human beings. They're seen as thugs. So oftentimes we kind of look at this kind of idea of, you know, if you think about the idea of I don't know, Jeremy or something, who you know, little white boy whose friend was stabbed in front of him, then there would be so much kind of wraparound care. But yet for black boys, it's seen as that is what we do and that is who we are. Then of course there's a lack of opportunities, you know, opportunities for jobs and work. And then there's, when you are in work, there's the kind of microaggressions of having to think about yourself through someone else's eyes. To be assertive is to be seen as aggressive. You know, I stand outside my house and someone will get off the bus and the woman will clutch her bag, or you know, you're standing in the street talking to someone and someone will cross the road, as Vivienne was saying. And although as black men we can laugh about that, and you see that happening, and you might be standing with your boys or something like that, and you say, did that really happen? And you laugh about it. But as Vivienne was saying, the kind of continuation of that kind of bucket thing, where all these things kind of pile on top of each other, they keep on piling on top of each other, is really bad for your psyche. It's wearing away of your psyche. And then I wanted to sort of think about intergenerational trauma. And that is relived through our interaction with white supremacy. There's a writer and academic called Aisha Mackenzie Mavinga. She talks about recognition trauma and the kind of rage associated with the experience of racism, which is relived intergenerationally. And then there's the kind of idea of kind of, you know, the hypersexualized, animalistic, strong black buck, which still sees itself in, which is internalized. That racism is kind of internalized, and I believe it's kind of seen today, where black men will talk about creating a child as breeding, and you know, other things like that. And then of course there's the societal racism, and of course, as Alex started off, we're talking about the death of George Floyd and how that's kind of brought an awareness to white people of racism, that racism is actually real. But black people are very well aware of the kind of countless murders of black men and women in the US and in the UK. But until that point with George Floyd, it could be argued that that was not an open conversation. It wasn't a conversation that was really being had. And therefore you kind of live in a world where your experience is actually denied. And it's almost like a massive gaslighting, if you like. So this happens in psychiatry and psychotherapy and psychoanalysis. And it attempts to work, when it tries to attempt to work with black and ethnic minority clients, often reduced to the angry black man or woman without any thought, without the theorist giving any thought to the difference of experience. And also in there's a kind of power to make you comply. And if you don't comply, then there's a fear that is generated, and it feeds into their fantasies about you as being aggressive and so on. So this is part of the problem with mental health services, alongside a genuine mistrust, which is often justified mistrust. Black people are often not offered talking therapies. The problem with the system is cited as mental health literacy. So in my mind, that takes the problem away from the system and actually makes it a problem for the problem is located with black people. And then there's the kind of hierarchy, the kind of power dynamic, which actually is often faced when you're working with a white therapist, white male or female therapist, and your views of racism and your experience is actually created as part of your pathology, if you like. So what is the way out of this, or what is the solution to this? My experience of working with a number of Black men and women is about the need to create safe spaces, to give a safe space to express and to be heard. And that's the first step towards healing. So my interest is about creating these kind of brave spaces, and that can be in many, many different ways. So it can be in traditional therapy where there's one-on-one, but and that works for many Black people. But there has to be a reality of Black people's experience of racism if they want to bring that, so it's not pathologized and it's allowed to be a reality. I think oftentimes, there's something about keeping that away from the therapist, if you like. And then there's alternative ways as well. For me, that's my art practice, but also as Alex mentioned, Hood Mentality, which is a group of young Black men who are creating programs for young Black men, and kind of creating a social enterprise whereby, there's a delivery of services to institutions. And to just give you an idea of one of the projects that we do at Hood Mentality, there's one which is called No Gimmick Straight Lyrics. And what it's doing is it's kind of creating a space, a safe space, or a brave space for Black men to come together. The facilitators are Black men. Everyone in the space is a Black man. And there's no kind of, I am the facilitator. Yes, you're facilitating, but at the same time, you are also writing. You're also feeding back, getting criticism of your work and so on. And it's a space that allows you to kind of think about your experience as a Black man and not feel that you've got something watching you. So you've got to be careful what you say. And it's that, as Vivienne was showing in her kind of tap illustration, it's that allowing to relieve that pressure, and then maybe then you can start approaching things which until that time you've never been able to do. And that's what we see. We see people kind of saying that, just incredible testimonies about what that experience is actually like for the men to be in that space. So yeah, that's kind of it for me. Yeah.
Brilliant. Really appreciate that, Stephen. You know what? I mean, I think that was a really good balance of the topic from both of you. And, I was thinking, I had thought about a question before this, but it's almost as if maybe I'm asking the wrong question, but I'm going to go ahead and say anyway. But I feel like there was an answer within kind of what both of you have said. But, we've heard about how we have more to contend with than mainstream society. We're disproportionately represented in mental health detention, undertreated, overdiagnosed. And, we've heard about the discrimination and the imperialism and how exactly these things take a toll on our minds. And, we're talking about this as knowledge, like we know this stuff. And it's almost as if this knowledge is coming at the community level. It's coming from the average everyday person, you and me. It's coming from our experiences rather than the professional level. So I wonder if I'm directing the question to the wrong group, because my question's about what can the community do? But it's like, if we're coming up with all the knowledge and we already are, we've got our hands full, maybe I should direct the question to the professionals and to the services. But I'm gonna go ahead and go with what I plan to say, because I think as a response, it's important for us to build protective factors and resilience as much as we're able to, even though there's only a certain portion of this that's in our control. So my question's about what the everyday person should do, because to understand what to do in a lot of ways is a deeply personal experience. Psychologists and therapists, Ghislaine Kinuani, who's one of the leading voices on racial trauma in the UK, says that racial trauma vulnerability is different for different people and is influenced by protective factors such as self-esteem, availability of spaces to process racist experiences, social support. So trying to make space in our lives to improve our self-esteem. These are practices and having spaces to process our racist experiences. These are practices I believe we should prioritize. You know, we should practice essentially self-care. And I don't know if I don't know what the end's perspective on self-care is. I know that people have the perception that it's like bubble baths and cups of tea, but you know, I kind of see it as like a philosophy of making responsible and wise choices, forming attitudes about the self and others in the world in order to improve our lives. And you know, because all of the things that we do in life can potentially be a source of either strength or stress or both. So in caring for ourselves, we might prioritize looking after, you know, all of the different facets of our lives. Personally, I focus on spiritual well-being a lot, as I find that that's my natural inclination, but there's like socio-cultural and environmental and physical and other factors depending on who you are. So to get to the question, because it's a bit of a long-winded, but basically, you know, we also, as Galen Kinwani suggests, we need to create spaces, and as Stephen was talking about, we need to create spaces to encourage like processing of our experiences and openness. And so how do we bring the conversation to the ends in an interesting way, and how do we make these conversations apply to us? Because even though I don't think stigma is a problem unique to us, I think because we suffer disproportionately, we need to care disproportionately in response to that. So yeah, I'll open it up to you guys. Like, what do you think the everyday person should be doing or thinking about outside of like, maybe outside of the going to counseling and, you know, the things that might be a bit more, you know, a bit more obvious? Like, what do you think, how do you think we can prepare people and bridge the gap between the experts or the psychology and psychiatry professionals and the general public?
Okay, I mean, I think as you were talking, I was just thinking, and I might be wrong, but I was just thinking about, you know, how complex that is with, I mean, it seems quite simple, but it's so complex in terms of how you get somebody to, you know, because people have different things which are going on for them, if you know what I mean. But one of the things I think on an individual level for myself anyway, and one of the things I have to remind myself of, do you know what I mean, is quite simple, really. It's just be kind to yourself. And, you know what I mean? And sometimes we have to, you know, and that's what I mean when it's complex because people have different levels of trauma, if you know what I mean. So, you know, you can't just say that for everyone because someone might not be able to get to that point, if you like. But if you can, then it's about, you know, sometimes we have to, you know, if we have an understanding of if you like, a good, what is good, if you know what I mean, if we've got to that point, then it's really about trying to parent yourself and to work out, think, you know, take that time to think about yourself and what's good for you in a way that you would do for, you know, your child, if you like. Again, I say that there's lots of other, there's lots of complexities around that, but I think be kind to yourself is quite major for me, actually, because that kind of takes the pressure off sometimes. And as a group, I suppose, conversations, I think sometimes, I mean, it's such a difficult thing to say. I mean, I think some of the work that I'm doing and the work that the young guys are doing, I mean, I mentioned, you know, no gimmicks, but there's also, you know, a barbershop project, which is to get young guys just to talk. And then we're doing another football project, which is just to think about, you know, resilience. So there's different ways to kind of think about, you know, mental health without it being mental health, but it being, how do you develop resilience and think, and how do you find spaces the way you can start thinking about these things and how they kind of relate to you? Do you know what I mean? So yeah, I mean, another thing I was just thinking about is, but this is really, particularly with myself actually, is just about finding time to be quiet. You know what I mean? Sometimes we don't actually allow ourselves to stop and to think. We're just constantly kind of going. So to be present is actually, but then some people find being present very, very difficult and often even traumatic, if you know what I mean. So it's a complex one. Yeah.
Vivienne?
So I completely agree with Stephen. Firstly, definitely, I think compassion to yourself, kindness to yourself, is really important, because I think there is a lot of pressure. And I think, you know, like we've been talking about, when there's all these external pressures, that becomes internalized. So even when it's not happening anymore, it's very easy to still, you know, hold yourself to a certain standard, or, you know, feel like you don't fit in, or feel like people are looking at you in a certain way. So yeah, that compassion for the healing process, and the fact that there are external factors that are contributing to the way you feel, that's definitely been something that's been very healing for me, like acknowledging there's a wider picture. It was interesting when you were saying, like, what can we do as a community? And I feel like it's a combination. Like, we can't, it's something that services also need to reach out and change and be better. Obviously we have our things to do, but yeah, services have known for years. Like, I think the first time they actually published papers around the fact that there were higher rates of schizophrenia and psychosis in Black men was a good 20 years ago. So, you know, they've known in the literature for a long time, and in the stats for a long time. So it's not new, and there hasn't necessarily been this kind of big push to improve that. So I feel like services do need to improve their access for the Black community, and improve their cultural competencies. The services just aren't, you know, culturally appropriate, and that's something that needs to improve. In terms of what we can do, though, the first thing that came to mind was holistic health. So I've got a slide. Oh, I can't share yet. I think you might need to give me access, you know.
Okay, bear with me.
Okay. Yeah, it's holistic health. Because, like we've identified, it's a very complex thing that we're living in. There's so many layers to it in our life that are going to contribute to our well-being. And that's where I feel like holistic health has a really good way of looking at things. So let me see if I can make it bigger. That was bad. Yeah, so this is what I try to do for myself personally, and even when I'm working with patients, and the NHS is trying to adopt this kind of like holistic approach. We use different outcome measures where we're kind of asking about people's social determinants. So, like, you know, do you need support with your job? Do you need support with your housing? What are your relationships like? You know, do you feel connected to your community? And these are the kind of things that contribute to our mental well-being. It's not as simple as, you know, you take a pill and you're better. If your whole living environment isn't healthy, then the pill is not going to solve that. So yeah, I would say, like, considering all these different areas, and maybe finding that time of silence to reflect on it. I think emotionally, there's, like we were talking about earlier, in terms of how we feel about being vulnerable and opening up, like having spaces like the ones that Stephen has created, making those safe spaces for ourselves and changing the narrative, that we're allowed to be emotional, like we're allowed to be vulnerable, and it doesn't mean we're intimidating or dangerous or angry. And even if you are angry, you know, you've got a very good reason to be. So I don't understand. Like, Solange said it in one of her songs. Listen, anyway, you're not going there, but Solange said it in one of her songs where she's like, you know, I've got a lot to be mad about. And I'm like, yes, you do. Like, there's a lot of injustice in the world, and I think we shouldn't pretend like there isn't. We're human beings, so, you know, it's normal to feel angry. So yeah, there's that. Obviously, physically, you know, physical engagement, whatever that looks like. Socio-cultural, I think that's super important, and I feel like the Black community is rich in culture. Like, we're rich in culture sometimes without even knowing it. Like, the concept of even being Black British is so amazing. Like, we have the mix of Africans and Caribbeans, but then we've also mixed that in with being Londoners, you know, well, and I guess across the UK as well, but specifically in London, there is such a vibe to being from our community. So I feel like, you know, we need to tap into that, and there's a lot of healing and, you know, solace in the spaces that we create for ourselves, even if it's just live events or, you know, someone's birthday and everyone's turned up. Like, those are spaces where it gives us some sense of community. Things like financial, you know, complicated because of all the social, economical issues. But yeah, I think you touched on it as well, Alex, like the spiritual aspect as well. I think that's super important. I feel like that's something that's not addressed as much within the NHS, and having a sense of spirituality and purpose is super important. There's a therapy called logotherapy that's linked in, I think it originated in Japan, where it was looking at aligning your life with your purpose, what you're good at and what you enjoy doing, and how that can allow you to live longer. And I think that's super important and something that's missed a lot. And then even intellectually, like allowing ourselves to be challenged. So what are we doing to push ourselves out of our comfort zone? So that's why the writing sessions that Stephen's talking about, I think, are great, because, you know, if you're not used to writing or you're not used to sharing, like it's forcing you out of your comfort zone, and in those spaces, that's where we feel a sense of growth and purpose. So yeah, I think we can do a lot of things, and maybe like looking at it in this way is helpful in terms of setting a direction. But I will still call out, you know, services. I still feel like they need to do better. They've known for a long time, and there needs to be some kind of duty of care. Community psychology is something I've been learning about at work. I've got an amazing supervisor who has been, you know, teaching me about what that looks like, and the fact that it's considering the social context, and the fact that, you know, we don't live in a vacuum. Me as a Black woman means that I do experience sexism and I do experience racism, and that needs to be considered when psychologists are working with people and not pushed to the side. And then also having a social action element to it, where you're putting the power back in people's hands. So whether that means, you know, setting up your own enterprise like Stephen's doing, or, you know, raising money for a local charity, or setting up a partner or a susu, like it's claiming back the power that society's taken away from you. So I think all those aspects really make a difference, and I think it is possible, but we just need to keep the conversations going and really commit to it. And acknowledge that it's going to be a long journey and it's not easy, but like Stephen said, like we need to be compassionate with ourselves, like that's okay, and it's a step-by-step process.
Something, Vivienne, you know, when you were just talking, I was just thinking, actually, you know, there's something about yeah, being kind to yourself, but also being brave. Do you know what I mean? So as a community level, I think that's what we need to do, to be brave, and in many ways kind of make the action, you know, do what we want to see happen, if you know what I mean, and to maybe kind of dare to dream. And yeah, the other thing I was thinking about was really about, you know, the idea of services providing for the community. And I kind of mentioned this earlier in terms of this idea of mental health literacy, where it's almost like you have to know how to access this service. And I think that there needs to be more work done the other way around, where it's just like, well, let's come to you and let's work out what you need, if you know what I mean, because it's quite an easy way of kind of disregarding a lot of people. And again, it kind of feeds into that kind of idea of hierarchy and kind of, you know, powerlessness, if you know what I mean. Yeah.
Yeah, I was thinking, did I ask the question in the wrong direction? But yeah, you guys have got me feeling hopeful. I really, really, yeah, like those answers I think have given me a lot to think about. So do you guys have a question for the group?
Yeah,
go
do you want to go, Stephen?
No, you go.
I was going to ask, I guess, based on like what Stephen does, and I think it's super important, like how, so like, for example, with ADHD Babes, we do fortnightly sessions, and a lot of the time the conversation is saying, like people are saying at the end, they feel like it was a safe space. And someone said to us the other day that, you know, they've done therapy for years, but this is the first time they felt able to, like they felt, what word did they use? It was akin to safe. Anyway, something along those lines. It's the first time they felt that way in a group. And it had me thinking, and then based off what Stephen was saying as well, like how do we create spaces for our community to feel safe? How do mental health services reach out in a way that is accessible? Like how do we create that change? Because I guess like the only thing I can see at the moment is that like the space is only for Black women or non-binary people, but that's the only kind of, I haven't asked anything else, like what is it that's making it feel safe for you right now? So it'd be interesting to figure out what that is so it can be replicated.
I mean, I really feel quite passionately that, you know, for instance, if you're doing a project about for young Black men, then they need to say what they need, if you know what I mean. And then you have to work it that way. Do you see what I mean? So it's pointless. Sometimes you've got these kind of evaluation kind of questions, and they're ticking boxes for what the organization wants or what the funder wants and all that kind of stuff, but they're not actually asking, those young Black men in that, who they're evaluating, actually, what do you want? If you know what I mean. So I think that's really important. One of the other things that I thought was really, it just came to mind, and I don't want to change the subject or anything, but just about, there's something about the group dynamic which is really, really, really powerful. And that's not to take away from the idea of one-on-one, because I think, that has benefits as well. If you find the right person that you can kind of work with, then you can really do some really great work on yourself. But there is something about the kind of group dynamic where people come together and they're able to kind of share and feel, and there's just something about that's really, really special. And sometimes you're working with people who maybe they're not necessarily taking to the kind of traditional therapies and all that kind of stuff. And if, again, it's always got to be down to the individual person, but oftentimes you might find that person might feel better in a group that's not a kind of therapy group as such, but just to be able to make contact with people in an honest way. And I suppose that kind of feeds into that kind of, well, what do you do as a community? How do you have, as a person in a community, how can you ask those questions where you make what is happening presently real, if you know what I mean? And I don't mean just to talk about racism and stuff like that, but what is happening, how can me and you can be in a room, and how can I have a conversation with you that makes that real in terms of what you're experiencing, if you know what I mean? And that might sound a little bit kind of out there, but I think ultimately that's all what we're trying to do, is make contact with other human beings in a real way. And oftentimes what we're doing is we're kind of putting on the false self, where we're basically profiling for other people's kind of ideas of who you should be. Do you know what I mean? So I think there's something about really breaking down that kind of the barriers that we have amongst ourselves as well. Yeah.
Yeah, I don't really have much to add to that. I think you guys have covered it well. I think maybe the only thing that I would add is, we talked about it already, but the social norms that exist, and just normalizing and making the conversation something that we just do. We just open up and bear what is. And whilst it isn't the norm, I suppose it will take some brave individuals to kind of break from what is the norm at the moment, even though we are heading in a direction of much more kind of acceptance of talking about mental health and talking about our feelings and just being open. But yeah, I think it will take people to just be brave and do it and step out of their comfort zone. And yeah.
It's kind of interesting, Alex, because it's something that, sometimes I think about, and it's about this kind of frame of mental health. And as you know, kind of mental health, we all have mental health. So, I might be here on the scale, you might be here on the scale, whatever it is, do you know what I mean? It's just a different level of where our health is, just like our physical health. But I suppose I wonder, how do we actually kind of frame it for ourselves? Because it has such a kind of connotation with institutions and traumatic institutions. Whereas one of the things that, when we're working on hood mentality is that we're really, really eager not to use mental health when we're talking. It's about our well-being is, again, for me, that's another little, bit of a kind of word, but there's got to be a way that we kind of frame our experience and our need, which doesn't necessarily kind of almost align itself with everything else that's going on, if you know what I mean, that's kind of, specific to us. And I think I have a feeling that that's quite important, to kind of own what's happening for us, if you know what I mean.
Yeah. So I know we're kind of nearing the closing time. We've got some questions in the chat, but before we go to those questions, Stephen, did you have a question? If you don't, no, we can go straight to the chat. So we've got somebody called Nawa Combo. Sorry if I'm butchering that pronunciation. They've said, can you suggest some community groups we can join to continue to hear conversations like these?
Well, Hood Mentality, you know, we're looking to start some different kind of conversations similar to these, particularly with young Black men. So if you kind of follow, then when that comes up, you'll see when those things are happening. We're looking at next year, March, to kind of start something like that.
I would say Black Minds Matter have started doing talks. We're actually doing an Insta Live with them next week, talking about ADHD. So those kind of conversations are happening with them. I think they've spread across. So I would definitely stay up to date with them. And yeah, similar to what Stephen's saying, next year we want to have a lot more conversations with ADHD Babes. Ours is specifically around neurodiversity. So it's kind of comorbid with mental health. But yeah, those conversations will be happening probably around June 2021 with us. But I would definitely recommend Black Minds Matter as a starting point. And obviously resilient mental health as well.
Yeah. And
you did my job.
Start following something, not that I'm a huge social media person, but when you start following something, then you'll get similar things which will come to you. So you'll sort of see, you know, what else is going on.
Also, BIPP do talks. They did some great talks. I think it was this year. I can't even remember now because of COVID. They do some really good talks about the Black and Asian community mental health. I can't remember what they stand for, but I think it's Black in psychology and psychiatry.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh,
okay.
I was thinking about Barton, which is the Black and Asian Therapy Network.
Oh, them too as well. Yeah, there's them. But BIPP, yeah, they're quite new, but I went to one of their courses this year and it was really, really informative. So I would check them out as well.
Thanks, guys. And then we've got a question from Nicole McIntosh. How can family and communities be reassured that there will not be further discrimination engaging with mental health services and make it a safe space?
Honestly, my initial answer is you can't. That's actually my initial answer, which is I didn't want to say it out loud, but I don't see how we can. I don't see how we can stop that right now. I think it's a process. I think there's a lot more conversations around discrimination within the mental health system. I think people aren't afraid to talk about it anymore. People aren't afraid to call it out, but I don't think it's been eradicated yet. I think the best thing you can do to mitigate that is to be aware, is to notice when these things are happening, is to call it out when it does happen. You know, if you have capacity, it doesn't have to be in that immediate moment. You can go away and formulate your words, make a complaint. There's mental health advocates that are set up to support in different areas. So finding your local mental health advocate to help support if you wanted to make a complaint. And then also having the space to debrief afterwards. I think intellectually people understand that, you know, Black people are discriminated against, but when it actually happens to you, it doesn't feel the way you think it will. So that's why it's very difficult to respond in the moment. So I think having the space afterwards, to a safer space with people that you know understand your experience, where you can unpack that and then choose to respond rather than react. But unfortunately, I don't think it's out yet. I don't think we've got, you know, all the people that have negative stereotypes and are in positions of power. I don't think we've got them all out yet. So I think it's just about staying resilient, staying aware, and fighting back against that resistance. And that resistance is a form of recovery in itself, because you're standing up for yourself, and you're standing up for the fact that you don't deserve to be treated that way. So yeah.
I don't really have that much to add to that. I just think in a similar way, I mean, I've had conversations with colleagues and people in kind of psychotherapy, and I'm kind of shocked at the kind of complete ignorance at what they're. I mean, it's really genuinely ignorance. They just don't know, if you know what I mean. So yeah, it does definitely exist, but I think everything that Vivienne said was right, and also kind of finding, if you can, just find other support systems outside of national health kind of thing. Do you know what I mean? And I'm not saying to go away from it, but at the same time, you find different ways of supporting yourself and thinking about what's happening for you and your family.
Yeah, brilliant. No, thanks for that. Yeah, I think you guys answered it. Nicole's just saying, can you put in the chat? I think she's talking about the services that we were mentioning earlier. So yeah, I can do that, no problem. So guys, I mean, we're coming towards the end now. Do you have any kind of final comments or sort of anything else to say?
I guess the only thing, or not the only thing, but the two things I think that are very key for me is that the stereotype that I think that, Black people have this problem that, we are treatment resistant or we're difficult to engage with. I want that myth in the bin. Like, I want it in the bin because it's not true. We very much engage, but we engage with things that are for us and things that are not against us. So I think the conversation needs to heavily move away from, all these negative stereotypes about us. And also the fact that there are these very high statistics also have an explanation. Because I remember someone saying this in a team meeting where they was like, they get sick and tired of hearing how, the statistics show that Black staff are less likely to be in managerial positions and it takes longer for them to rise up. And, Black men are more like they're sick of the stats because it makes them feel bad about themselves. So I think understanding, and that's why intersectionality helped me a lot, because it showed a wider context to why these stats are the way they are. And it's not a problem that is inherent to Black people, because when you go to spaces where we are the majority, such as Africa, the Caribbean, places like Haiti, Cuba, we do not have these high statistics that we have here. So there is something about being Black in Britain or Black in the West that creates this difficulty and creates, and fills our bucket to the top. And that's not an inherent problem with us. It's not something we've done. It's the context that we're in. So I think there was something freeing for me in understanding that there's a wider context to why, we're going through these difficulties, and seeing that that means that there's a way to solve it. It means there's a solution. It's not just fact. So I think, we need to change the narrative. We are able to engage with services, and that's why we have such community strength, and why, when it's someone's birthday, everybody turns out. Why when a child turns 1, the whole block is at the hall party, because we have a sense of community and that's a form of resilience. That's a form of mental health support. So I think we just need to change the narrative and acknowledge that there's a wider context that contributes to why we struggle, and that also means that there's a solution. So
Thank you, Vivienne. Stephen, do you have any final comments?
Very, very small. Was just about the need to kind of find ways that work for us, but also just coming back to what we said earlier, just like something to think about, was just about the same thing, and that's being kind to yourself and also being brave. I think those are the things we, to carry those things are quite important for us moving forward.
Brilliant. Thank you both. I'll just close by saying that I chose to call this resilient because I think we are, there's a little bit of like pushback against saying resilient because of, the idea that might put the onus on the person. But obviously there are things outside of our control. And as much as things are outside of our control, we are actually resilient. It's not a choice for us in my eyes. It's a necessity, because as much as we need to be gentle with ourselves, within the things that are in our control, we are actually disproportionately resilient compared to mainstream society because we're still here despite all that we've been through. So that's all I wanted to say. And thanks everyone for coming. Thank you again to Stephen and Vivienne. And if you guys want to kind of say, I don't know if you want to say your social media or anywhere where people can find you.
So you can find me on all social media as VVN Sings. So that's Victor November Sings. And please follow ADHD Babes as well. It's literally ADHD Babes. And we're across platforms as well. We're going to actually launch a fundraiser very, very soon because next year we want to expand our services. So payday is really coming. So everybody be emptying your pockets for us. And yeah, thank you, Alex, so much for having us. It's been really nice.
You can find out about Hood Mentality on hoodmentality.co, which is on the screen, but also as an arts practice, Quiet Voice Picks as well. I'm not huge on social media, but Hood Mentality is a good place to get some information in terms of what the young men are up to and how to get involved and that kind of stuff. So yeah.
Thanks, guys. And everyone, please follow Resilient MH on Twitter and subscribe if you're watching on YouTube. Thanks all. Really appreciate the talk. I think I got a lot from it, and I hope everyone else did. So see you guys.
Oh, thank you, Alex.
All right, then.
See you later.
Bye-bye.